Hi, so I'm married to a guy called Ross. His full name is Rosario Antonio Giovanni Ciano. He's Italian. And we have one little boy called Luca Domenico Ciano. And right now they're at a family party, a big Italian family party, so I've extricated myself from that to be here. So I teach at SMBC. I teach there about 2 days a week, and I just teach church history. I do from the beginning, so just after Jesus' resurrection, all the way through up until the church in Nazi Germany. So we do the full gamut. And I particularly love the English Reformation, so this really excites me. I did some further study on Cranmer, so I think on your little handouts advertising today it said he was the pin-up boy of Anglicans. That's not why I went for him, but he's a very fascinating man, and I hope you find that too. So, have you heard of Cranmer, other than the handout, yeah? Now you've got a heads up if you brought your little pamphlet along. What's he best known for? What are some things you can think of? Prayer book, great, yep. 39 articles. So he has 42 that he writes, and they're edited down to the 39 we have under Queen Elizabeth a few generations later. Other things we know him for? Yes, his death is quite memorable. Yeah, and that'll be a focus of what we do today. What position did he hold in the church? Yeah, Archbishop of Canterbury, which is huge. That's the number one position in the English church, in the Church of England. He comes out of Catholicism, so he was a Catholic. England was Catholic, okay? So this is about the shift from Catholicism to Protestantism that takes place. It's going to go back and forth for a bit, but it's going to land in Protestantism. And he's also known as kind of Henry VIII's right-hand man. What do we know Henry VIII for? What's he unfortunately famous for? All his wives, of course, Henry's wives. And Cranmer is very important in helping Henry divorce his first wife, Catherine. Very important. So that's what he's also known for. Okay. You've got on the front of your handouts here, this is the tower where Cranmer was imprisoned in Oxford, in England. And I'll just read the little blurb there. It says, "This tower, still standing amongst the busy streets of central Oxford, is where Thomas Cranmer was kept before his execution. While imprisoned, he saw Latimer and Ridley burned nearby. Soon after, he signed several recantations of his Protestant faith." So recantations means taking back. He took back his Protestant faith. However, when he came to the day of his execution, he revoked these recantations, so he took back what he took back, and as he faced the fire, he held out the hand that had signed the recantations to be burned first, crying out continually, "This hand has offended, this hand has offended." Cranmer was one of Queen Mary, Bloody Mary's most illustrious martyrs. However, rather than dissuading people from becoming Protestants, the people began to detest the violent hand of their Catholic queen. So Cranmer lives and serves under 3 monarchs: Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I. So we're just going to look at a slide now that shows some of this back and forthness. So Henry VII, top left. Did I put this in the handout for you? No. So Henry VII, top left, here's the first Tudor king. Here's the guy that defeats Richard III in battle. Do you remember they just found his bones under the car park? Yeah? So Henry kills Richard in battle, becomes the new king. So the dynasty's a little bit rocky, partly why Henry really needs a male heir, he thinks. Then you've got Henry VIII. Henry VIII, we generally put in the Roman Catholic column. If being Protestant is believing justification by faith, Henry is not Protestant. If being a Protestant is separating from the church in Rome, the Roman Catholic Church, Henry is a Protestant. So theologically we'll put him in the Roman Catholic box. His son, though, very, very Anglican, very reformed. But his son only becomes king at 9 years of age, dies at about 15. So there's not much time to go that way, but that's under Edward, that's where Cranmer really flourishes. Then it swings back under Bloody Mary, and Elizabeth very wisely chooses the middle way. So Cranmer will be under Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I. Does that make sense? Just this big picture to get in your head before we launch in. We're going to watch a short clip of a DVD now just to introduce Henry, Edward, Mary and Elizabeth and just kind of get them in our heads. Before you press play, I should just explain that he's going to use the words Royal Supremacy in this. What that means, Royal Supremacy, is that the King or the Queen is head over the Church, not the Pope. Okay, so when you hear that, that's what it means.
It is 1544. King Henry VIII, now in the third decade of his reign, bestrides England like an ageing colossus. By making himself supreme head of the Church of England, he'd taken the monarchy to the peak of its power, but at a huge personal cost. For his headship of the Church, known as the Royal Supremacy, had been born out of Henry's desperate search for an heir and love. The resulting turmoil of 6 marriages, 2 divorces, 2 executions and a tragic bereavement had produced 3 children. Now the king felt it was time for reconciliation. Henry's reunion with his family is commemorated in this famous painting known as the Family of Henry VIII. The painting shows Henry enthroned between his son and heir, the 7-year-old Prince Edward, and, to emphasise the line of dynastic succession, Edward's long-dead mother, Jane Seymour. Standing further off to Henry's right is Mary, his elder daughter, whom he'd bastardised when he divorced her mother. And to Henry's left, his younger daughter, Elizabeth, whom he'd also bastardised when he'd had her mother beheaded. But the painting is more than a family portrait. It's also a symbol of the political settlement by which Henry hoped to preserve and to prolong his legacy. He decided that all 3 of his children would be named as his heirs. His son Edward would, of course, succeed him. But if Edward died childless, the throne would pass to Henry's elder daughter, Mary. And if she had no heir, then her half-sister Elizabeth would become queen. The arrangement was embodied both in the king's own will and in a parliamentary act of succession. Henry's provisions for the succession held, and through the rule of a minor and 2 women, gave England a sort of stability. But they also ushered in profound political turmoil as well, since it turned out each of Henry's 3 children was determined to use the royal supremacy to impose a radically different form of religion on the English. The resulting conflicts would send hundreds to a terrible death at the stake or on the scaffold. They would even force Queen Elizabeth I to execute a fellow anointed sovereign.
So we've got that thing called the Royal Supremacy, where under Henry he makes himself the head of the church. And so with that first chart I showed you with the swings, that's what Cranmer's going to get caught in. When the king is Catholic, you need to be Catholic. When the king is Protestant, you need to be Protestant, if you want to keep your head, that is. And then it swings back. There was a vicar in a small country town in England who survived Henry, Edward, Mary, Elizabeth. And they asked him, how did you manage to keep your head through all this? And he said, it's simple. I'm the vicar of this town, so I'll do whatever I need to stay the vicar. So it wasn't always in the hearts of the people, it was in the hearts of many people, but it's a very top-down approach in the beginning stages. Okay, so you've got a bit of context of the Reformation. What else would be helpful? for you to know. So I'm on page 2 if you're writing little notes, a bit more of the context of the English Reformation. So Henry, if we can look at that, a handsome man. Apparently he had gout. Can understand why. He was quite short and ate well. And he needed a son, a male heir. That's what he wanted, right? So all this is pretty much a quest for a male heir. So his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, she's Spanish, Catholic. She'd failed to produce one. They'd had a series of miscarriages, and only their daughter Mary, who becomes future Queen Mary, is going to survive beyond infancy. That's very sad for her. But in addition, one of the Queen's young attendants, Anne Boleyn, has become pregnant to Henry in the process. And so he desperately wants to marry Anne to make the heir legitimate. So, in order to separate from Catherine and marry Anne, Henry needs to ask the Pope for a divorce, essentially, from Catherine. Remember, England's still Roman Catholic. But Pope Clement is his name. He says no to the annulment because Catherine is the auntie of the Holy Roman Emperor. And the Holy Roman Emperor has pretty much just put his thumb on Rome. And so he's invaded and he basically supports the papacy. So the Pope is stuck, right? He can't say yes to this. So you've got Henry wanting a divorce and an annulment technically, because he wants to say he never should have married Catherine in the first place. And the Pope saying no because he feels indebted to Catherine's family. So if the Pope's not going to shift his position, then in order for the divorce to be legitimate, Henry needs to separate from the Pope and Rome. Does that make sense? So he's going to, if the Pope's going to say no, then he's just going to say, well, you don't get a say over what I do because the English Church is no longer tied to you. So that's the long process that's going to happen now. So Henry starts out negotiating with the Pope. It was a long, long time, years and years. But as time wears on, he becomes more forceful in his dealings with the Pope. And in the end, the English Church is going to split from the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, so that's what's happening. What about Cranmer? So Cranmer becomes Archbishop of Canterbury. So we've got two pictures of him. We've got him without his beard, so that's when he was like a Cambridge scholar. So this guy's the nerd, right? He's the university studying the Bible there nerd. He just wants a quiet life with his books, kind of like Augustine, if you were here with me last year. So when he becomes Archbishop of Canterbury, he just does not want it. For other reasons too. So he becomes Archbishop of Canterbury in 1533, and the next slide, also him, that's another image of him. There's pretty much only two that are shown. And he grows his beard after the death of Henry VIII. That's part of his mourning. So that shows how close he was to Henry VIII. They really were very, very close. So Cranmer becomes Archbishop of Canterbury in 1533, so that's the number one position in the English Church. And he is a reform-minded man, okay? So he's already thinking some Reformation thoughts before he's appointed. And part of his Reformation thoughts is he believes from the Bible that the king should be the head of the English Church, not the Pope. Okay, so that's a core belief of his, that the king should be the head of the English Church, not the Pope. And so as Henry's looking around for someone to give him a hand kicking the Pope out the door, he lands on Cranmer and says, this would be a good guy to get in my camp. And so that's what he does. So it's from very early on in his career, Cranmer, when he was studying at Cambridge, rejected the Pope's rule in England. So Henry seeks his help largely because of this. And so for a long time, they try and find for the king some sort of theological and legal justification for the divorce. It's all quite complicated, so I won't get into it now. But Cranmer even does road trips around Europe, mainland continental Europe, to all the universities to try and get some help there, to say, universities which really focused on studying the Bible then, wanted to come up with some arguments to make this divorce, this annulment, legitimate. Like I said, it goes on and on and on. And then in 1532, while Cranmer's on one of these road trips, the current Archbishop of Canterbury dies, and Cranmer gets the call up, and he doesn't want to take it. Partly because he doesn't feel able. He just says, I'm not capable. He says, quote, he felt a great inability to such a promotion. That's his words. And partly because he was very sorry to leave his study, he said, but especially because he believed that the king is the head of the church in England, and the position of Archbishop of Canterbury comes at the Pope's hand. So he says, I don't want to take it if it means getting my authority from the Pope. So even in his coronation's the wrong word. What's the word? Consecration ceremony? He makes a point, or he tries to make a point, comes up later at his trial, that he did not receive his authority from the Pope. He received it from the king. So even early on, that's Cranmer's thinking. So that's really important for what we'll land at later today. And one of the first things that Cranmer does, having been appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, was to declare Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void. In 1533, Henry marries a pregnant Anne Boleyn, who later becomes Queen of England. So there's her B for Boleyn. She's also a Protestant-minded woman, and so is her family. She's certainly a Protestant queen. So now we're going to watch another clip. It's about 5 minutes long, and this one summarises how Henry split from Rome and became head of the Church of England. Okay, so that's the big momentous thing of the English Reformation. So this is the big shift you need to get in your head. So Rome had been over the English church up until now. That gets scrubbed out, and now the monarch is over the English church. Make sense? Okay. It's on page 3 if you're following that. So, just before we get to Cranmer's dilemma, I'll just say a few quick things. We'll just race through the PowerPoints and I'll talk through them. So the next one, we have an excerpt from the Act of Supremacy. So the King's Majesty justly and rightly is and ought to be and shall be reputed the only supreme head in earth of the Church of England, called Angliana Ecclesia. So that's where the word Anglican comes from. Okay, next one. Henry's 6 wives. Poor women. Do any of you or your children watch Horrible Histories? Do you get into that? Yes. It's a great show. I love it. And if you looked up Horrible Histories' Henry VIII's Wives song, it's very clever, packs a lot in, and summarises the poor fate of these 6 women. So we've got Catherine top left, she's divorced, only has Mary as a daughter. Then we've got Anne Boleyn. She gives birth to a boy or a girl, do you think, after all that? A girl. They didn't have scans in those days. It was probably a good thing. So Anne gives birth to a baby girl called Elizabeth. So that's going to be Queen Elizabeth. She's found guilty of... supposedly, but she's convicted of adultery with 6 people, probably trumped up charges, and so off with her head. Then we have the lovely Jane Seymour that Henry calls the love of his life, top right. She gives birth to Edward, his long waited for son, and dies very shortly after the birth. So that's Henry's great heartache. Then bottom left, we've got Anne of Cleves. He married her, I guess you could call it almost like online dating. He saw the picture of her, agreed to marry her, and then he saw her face to face and said, I'm not having that. Said she looked like a horse. And so that's quickly done away with, very quickly done away with. Next woman, Catherine, she's found guilty, probably rightly so, of adultery, and so off with her head. And thank goodness his last wife, Catherine, outlives him and nurses him to an old age. So that's Henry's wives. And the next slide, I love, books. If you can't find it here, it doesn't exist. And the title of the book is Making Marriage Work by Henry VIII. Okay, next slide, we've got the Whitehall mural. So this is his family as Henry sees it. Henry on the left, his much-loved wife Jane, the heir of as the mother of his son on the right, and his mum and dad. So that's who he sees as his real family. And then we have King Edward on the next slide, little boy. You see the Pope getting his neck squashed on the bottom. Yep. Very symbolic. And that's Henry on the left pointing, this is my son, this is who's going to take over after me. But like I said, he's very sickly all his life and he dies very young, but he does accomplish a lot in his reign. And then we have Queen Mary, Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, and she also dies childless. So Edward dies childless, Mary dies childless, Elizabeth dies childless, she never marries. And so that's the end of Henry's Tudor reign. Okay. Now we're going to watch something to introduce Cranmer's great dilemma. So it's in episode 3. Sorry to do that to you. I'll just keep talking as we set that up. Yeah, so he was working as a child, well picked up. So he had something around him called the Regency Council, who were set up to help him rule because he was so young. I don't know if you can picture some 9-year-olds in your head. Imagine crowning them the King of England. So they put up a council around him and they're reform-minded men. So Edward is staunchly reformed, even though he's young. He knows his own mind. And the men around him are very Protestant, very reformed as well. So we're going to watch this clip. So we've got Queen Mary in it. So she's the daughter of Henry's first wife. She's very Catholic. She's also very angry that King Henry divorced her mum. And she holds Cranmer responsible for this, which I think is an unofficial reason why he ends up going to his death. Okay. And sorry, as you think about it, did I put questions on there for you? Here's my little handout. If this helps you to tune in, think about what's his dilemma, what does that dilemma lead him to do, and what happens when he's asked to read out his recantations on the day of his death. Exactly right. So he has argued that the monarch is to be obeyed. That includes in religious issues because he's head of the church. But now the monarch is Catholic. What's he going to do? It gets quite tricky for him because the Royal Supremacy for him only works when the king or queen is Protestant, like himself. So when Catholic Mary comes to the throne, he's caught between obedience to her as the queen, obedience to Christ. It becomes tricky as well because Mary is Catholic, she believes that the church needs to submit to Rome, not her. And so Cranmer, in wanting to try and obey her, which he can't, it's impossible for him to, she's saying, don't obey me, obey the Pope. So there's lots of trickiness and messiness going on, but what you said nailed it. It only works when the king or the queen is Protestant. Does that make sense? Do you want me to? Yep. Yes. So that's the main divisions that are happening at the moment. And because the Church of England is such a top-down at this stage and still is approach, you need to obey your monarch. And so if your monarch is Protestant, you need to be Protestant, and vice versa. Does that answer your question?
Is recantation more to do with I now submit to the Pope as head of the Church rather than his beliefs about faith? Or is it both?
Good. Is it about his beliefs about the Pope and the Church, or is it about faith? Is it also about fear? Lots of people say, because he's just seen. Yeah, the content, sure. So yes, so it's about both things, which is what's really interesting. It's about the Pope, and it's about Protestant beliefs such as the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, which was a big marker back then that marked you as Protestant or Catholic. So it had both in his signed recantations. Yeah.
And amongst that, they had appointed the Archbishop or the Bishop or something had to be appointed by Parliament. Is that the reason why? Because it's part of that business when the King puts it down to the Parliament, etc., it comes down instead of coming through like we do, we appoint our own.
Yes. Yes. So technically, who's the head of the... he was asking... sorry, I'll try and summarise as best I can. You recently saw something where a bishop was appointed by Parliament, essentially, as in England. Does that come out of the structure of the Anglican Church? And yes, that's exactly how it is. Technically, who's still the head of the Anglican Church? The Queen. Yeah. Interestingly, if Charles, her son, becomes king, he wants to be called Defender of the Faiths rather than Defender of the Faith. So we'll see what happens there. Okay, so that's his dilemma. I think you've got that. I'll be saying it a little bit again as we go on. What does the dilemma lead him to do? Yep, and before he renounces his recantations, he recants. So first he recants, then he takes it back. Good. And what happens when he's asked to read out his recantation on the day of his death? Doesn't go to plan. And there's a lot of text of kind of that trial and his speech that we can read, which is really interesting. I've got some excerpts near the end of the handout, but you can read the words he really set up there, trying to give his final speech. Okay, we're going to watch a YouTube clip of Cranmer at St Mary's Church reading his confession and then being burnt at the stake. And I like this because it does use a lot of Cranmer's own words here. I'm going to have a quick look at some PowerPoints now of those events. Unfortunately, I didn't have the digital camera then. But they did have Fox's Book of Martyrs was just being printed. You've heard of that, I presume? And a key feature of this book in its first editions were woodcuts. And you've got to remember or know, if you don't already, that the printing press has been invented fairly recently before this, and so now books are getting mass produced and going to print, and one of them can be Fox's Book of Martyrs. So you've got a lot going on in this woodcut image, and it is the burning of Bishop Ridley and Bishop Latimer in Oxford. So they're getting burnt there. Latimer says to Ridley, Ridley says to Latimer. Latimer says to Ridley, "Be of good cheer, Master Ridley, and play the man, for today we will light such a candle in England as shall never be put out." So that was his last words to his friend at the stake. The thing I want you to also notice is top right. See that little figure in the castle, in his tower, his prison tower? Cranmer. So apparently he did see this happen. So a lot of historians, some historians, say Cranmer is a bit weak-willed, vacillates, changes his mind, recants, takes back his recantations, was just scared, couldn't make up his mind. So there are some of the accusations thrown at Cranmer. I think there's more than that going on for him. Let's look at the next slide. So here we've got Cranmer putting his hand into the fire to be burnt first. It was a rainy day, which tends to be in England anyway. I lived there for 3 years, so I can say that. No offence to any English people in the crowd. And so I don't know if the flames would have happened as quickly as we saw in that clip. But anyway, he was eventually engulfed with flames. The next one. We've got the doors at Balliol College in Oxford, which are actually scorched. You can go and see where they're a bit scorched at the bottom by the burning of Ridley, Latimer and Cranmer. Next one. On the right's the actual spot in the road where he was burnt. That's all that exists there now. And this little inscription on the left just said it was done in Broad Street and the dates. Next slide. That's the tower where he was imprisoned, where he would have looked down, so it's quite close onto that cross. Next one. You zoom back and it's just opposite a KFC in the middle of the high street. So lots of people just walk past and you'd have no idea of the events that had unfolded. Oh, and there you go, it's raining. I remember when I took that photo, I might have as well have just jumped in a pond that day. I was just so wet. Anyway, next one. And again, it's just in the middle of the street, people going over it all the time. Have I got some other shots of that? I think I've got 2 more. So there, you can't even see it there, can you? You see a little bit up there? So most people don't even realise what it's doing there in the street. Okay. So, Cranmer's dilemma. Next slide. It's the big idea that you've already got in your heads, which is great. Royal supremacy means the monarch is over the church. Cranmer really believes that. I'm just going to contrast it with one of his Protestant convictions, save doing all of them. One of them was the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. So the Catholic position, transubstantiation, which is, I've put on page 5, but do you know what it is? Can you think how to describe it? So the bread and the wine are actually really transformed into the body and blood of Jesus in the ceremony, even though they retain the outward appearance of bread and wine. It really is the body and the blood of Jesus. Cranmer's mature position, he goes through several stages. He does start at transubstantiation, like the good Catholic boy he was, and he eventually arrives at this thing called real presence, which is the idea that Jesus is present in the bread and the wine in a true, real spiritual way in the communicants, so the people taking communion, if they really belong to Jesus. So Jesus is really there when you sit down and have communion, is what he's saying, because he's with you, the true believers. Does that make sense? So it's a real spiritual presence of Christ. There's something special going on in the communion service. It's more than just a remembering. So the benefit is more than just a remembering of what Jesus did, is Cranmer's position. Okay. On to page 6 if you're following me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trace those 2 ideas briefly through the 3 monarchs he served under. If this is of interest to you, you can look up further details. It's something I wrote. It should be easy enough to find. Or I can email you a copy or something if this interests you. If not, just smile and look interested. Okay. King Henry VIII. I don't think I've got any. Actually, we'll just leave that to keep looking at as we go through. So what does he do under King Henry? How does the royal supremacy work out for him? So King Henry leads to tension of conscience for Cranmer, because the king, like we saw in that very first slide, theologically he's still Catholic, And he just does things. He's a, what could you call him? He's a pragmatic king, right? So he makes decisions to get stuff done. So even when there's theological change in England, it's just to have a better relationship with that country over there, so I don't get invaded by that country, and now my people are getting a bit upset, so I better change back. And so it's not out of great conviction. So Cranmer does struggle under Henry, including with his doctrine of the Eucharist. So Henry tries to bring in something called the 6 Articles, which Protestants call the bloody whip of 6 strings, because of the harsh penalties for not obeying what was in them. Very, very harsh. And essentially, I won't read out that whole quote, but that's essentially saying that the body and blood of Jesus are really there in communion. So what's Cranmer going to do at that point? What he does in Parliament is he respectfully challenges Henry on that, but in the end he gives way and submits to Henry, and this passes. So Fox, in his Book of Martyrs, says that Cranmer did oppose Henry, but said he did it in such a respectful manner to the king that Henry could not be offended with him. Despite Cranmer's opposition, the articles still go through. Henry asked Cranmer to stop opposing him, and Cranmer has no option to obey. So in submitting to Henry and yielding to these 6 articles, for Cranmer it's the Royal Supremacy that comes out on top under Henry. Okay, is that all right? Okay, under Edward. This is a lot easier because these 2 ideas are largely synchronised under Edward, but Cranmer can only go as fast as Edward wants and within the bounds that Edward wants. Edward's still king who makes the decisions. So this is when the 2 prayer books come out, the 42 articles, lots of the homilies. This is the big production period, these 6 years for Cranmer. So do you do prayer books here at this church at all? No? Any liturgy? No? 8 a.m. you do? Do you do any liturgy in other services, like so liturgy things said together? Do you do a confession together? Other things said together? I'm seeing some nods, some very, very occasionally. Okay. I might just go on a slight tangent. I won't speak much longer on this, but I think the issue of liturgy is a tricky one, and often we do throw it out because it's old language, doesn't make sense, that's not how people talk anymore. And I want to say, in Cranmer's defence, when he wrote liturgy, when he wrote the prayer book, he was doing it to be contextualised. So instead of saying the Latin Mass together, he put it in English, which was huge, people could understand it. He wanted faith to be clear in the way it was spoken, and this is often still a bit of an illiterate society, so if people can say things together, then they're going to know it. Does that make sense? And he put it in language that was understandable at the time. So I think what the Anglican Church in Sydney has done in recent years in terms of putting out a new book of common prayer, things to say together, is really helpful, and I think Cranmer would be all for updating language. He wanted to be understood by the people. That's a Reformation principle. Needs to be understandable. And so things like that can be helpful to do, but you need to think about your context here in Rooty Hill and the surrounding suburbs. I minister in Marrickville with my husband. He's the minister there, and it's very multicultural as well. And so we need to think contextually, how do we best serve the people? And I think there are some hangovers of liturgy that are helpful to do even with non-English background speakers. Can be even good evangelism, because you can say to the people saying these things, you don't need to say it, or please don't say it if you don't feel this is what you believe, but here is what Christians believe. I believe in God the Father, the Nicene Creed, not that Cranmer wrote that, but do you follow what I'm saying? It can be helpful, is what I'm trying to say. Think contextual, and I think Cranmer would agree with that. Is that all right? Yeah. Okay, so lots of things race forward with Edward. But as you know, Edward dies young and it all starts to go wrong. Queen Mary. So Cranmer's Catholicism created Mary's Catholicism created great conflict of conscience for Cranmer. She rejected his belief in royal supremacy and accepted the authority of the Pope, which Cranmer rejects. And she also maintains the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, which Cranmer now claims is wrong. And I'm pretty sure that none of you would hold to transubstantiation, but in case you're thinking, what's the big deal going on here? Why is this such a big... A lot of ink was spilled in the Reformation over the Lord's Supper. You just have to remember, pardon? Cannibalism. Yes, sure, yeah, they were accused of, of cannibalism, as were the early Christians actually, they were accused of cannibalism. A lot of doctrines hinge on the idea of the Eucharist. So in transubstantiation, you're saying Jesus' sacrifice isn't enough, so you need to re-sacrifice him on the altar, okay? So it's slamming justification by faith. People could only have the bread, not the wine, because you'd hate to spill the blood of Jesus, so it's best if you just have the bread. But the priest can have the bread and the wine. So the priest and the people are different, okay? So priesthood of all believers is out the door. So there's lots of things going on there. The reason why the people only have the bread is because it really is the body of Jesus. So if it really is the body of Jesus, then his blood's somehow wrapped up in that too. And so in having one, you're having both. So that's all right with you, for you. So essentially it undoes, transubstantiation undoes justification by faith, alone in Christ alone. It undoes priesthood of all believers. It focuses on the church being the mediator. You see why it's important? Yeah? This is why Cranmer will lay down his life over this one. One historian helpfully summarises Cranmer's problem of conscience. He says he was reduced to a hopeless conflict in his own soul. He was in bonds to a doctrine which held to resist the crown would be against the law of God, and yet in bonds to a conscience which held that to submit would be an act of spiritual disloyalty to Christ. And under Mary, Cranmer's doctrine of the monarchy unravels internally, so his royal supremacy doctrine, because to submit to Mary, as his doctrine of royal supremacy demanded, would consequently mean submitting to the Pope. However, submitting to the Pope would deny royal supremacy. So both royal supremacy and his doctrine of the Eucharist are going to lead him to his death. It's both of those together. So just to end on his death, within 2 months of Mary coming to the throne, he's summoned in for trial. He's arrested and charged on account of his doctrines of the monarchy and the Eucharist. He's also wrapped up in that Lady Jane Grey affair. I won't get into it. That's all right. So he goes into his trial, and as he walks in, his belief in royal supremacy is very clear from the outset, because as he walks into that church, he won't take off his cap as a sign of respect for the Pope's representative, but he will remove it and kneel down for the king's representative. And the matter of the Eucharist is very important at his trial, because they build a 3-metre high scaffold at the high altar so that the person officiating can sit under the sacrament of the altar. So these two things are playing out at his trial. And he's asked to make a confession of his faith, and I've put it in there in your summary on page 7, that last page. Cranmer says at his trial, "I will never consent to the Bishop of Rome," the Pope, "for then should I give myself to the devil. I have made an oath to the king, and I must obey the king by God's laws. By the scripture, the king is chief, and no foreign person in his realm above him. There is no subject but to a king. I am a subject. I owe my fidelity to the crown. The Pope is contrary to the crown. I cannot obey both. The Bishop of Rome is contrary to God and injurious to his laws." And he declares, Christ bids us to obey the king. The Bishop of Rome bids us to obey him. If I should obey the Pope, I cannot obey Christ. Eventually he's found guilty, has a long drawn-out prison thing where he sees Latimer and Ridley probably go to their deaths. And they're very long months in that prison, a real time of testing and isolation and terror. And he eventually buckles under the pressure and writes the first of his 6 recantations. And it's these two doctrines that form the focus, the content of his recantations. It's a bit of both. So he's deprived of his archbishopric before he gets to this point, and then he's handed over to the temporal authorities to be executed. But you have to remember, at this stage in England, it's one and the same. Yeah, we don't have a separation of church and state yet. So in his signed recantations, he says, "I recognise the authority of the Pope as the supreme head of the Church on earth and as the Vicar of Christ. I also affirm transubstantiation." So he signs off on both of those, the opposite of both of those. So they put his recantations before the Queen. Repentant heretics should be pardoned, but he is not. Maybe because Mary's got a personal vendetta against Cranmer for making her a bastard, essentially, and divorcing her parents. So orders are sent to London that Cranmer's to be burned the next day, so no wasting time here. The next day he's going to burn, and it's in that time that Cranmer makes those little changes that he's going to read out. Following day comes, he goes to that church, a sermon is preached, and then they hand the platform over to Cranmer to read his recantations as promised, so that everyone would understand that he's a good Catholic now. So he starts as expected. He recites the creed, he affirms the basics of the Catholic faith, and then he comes, quote, "to the great thing which so troubles my conscience, more than anything I ever did or said in my whole life." So he's coming to the thing that he's most sorry about in his life. And the authorities, they have the text of the recantation in front of them, right? So they're sure that he's about to say, the things I'm really sorry for are all those Protestant beliefs I held. I'm really sorry about those things. But the things he says that he's most sorry for are his recantations. And you saw that clip. The writings contrary to the truth are the things he was most sorry for, his recantations. So he took it back. When they realise what he'd said, a commotion breaks out, but Cranmer perseveres in shouting to get 2 more points across. I don't think it was probably when he was being dragged out the corridor. I think he actually got it out from the pulpit, this bit, and we'll finish more or less with this. The quote on the bottom of page 7 for you. he says, as he's being slowly pulled down, "As for the Pope, I refuse him as Christ's enemy and Antichrist with all his false doctrine. And as for the sacrament, I believe, as I have taught in my book against the Bishop of Winchester, which my book teaches so true a doctrine of the sacrament, the Eucharist, that it shall stand at the last day before the judgment of God, where the papistical doctrine contrary shall be ashamed to show her face." So he takes back both in his last moments. Off he goes to the stake, and that's when his hand is burned first, that's signed. And Mary's plan is undone to make a statement with him. He becomes the statement in himself for his Protestant beliefs. And Cranmer essentially totally redeems himself in that movement. So we'll finish there. I'll just share one reflection with you before I take some questions. One thing I think we can learn about Cranmer for this day and age is, I guess, him as a nuanced man. So, like I said, he gets a lot of bad press. They say you couldn't make up your mind, you're weak-willed, you don't have backbone. But I think what was going on was a real struggle between these two things for him. I think that was his real... that's why he's going back and forth with his recantations and stuff. So I think it helps us have, I guess you could call it maybe epistemic humility, being humble about what you know and you don't know, and also what others know and don't know. So Cranmer didn't have it all together, right? He starts with transubstantiation, he lands at something very different. He's constantly working out how these two fit together, right? So I think it's good for us to remember that we don't have it all figured out at any point in time, do we? We're always reforming our own minds based on the scriptures. And so we need to allow ourselves to change. It's all right to say, I was wrong 5 years ago, I believe this now. And you might say it again in another 5 years. And I think that's helpful as well when we look at other people to say they're allowed to change their minds too. And I think particularly we can show less grace to people in the public sphere who do this. We can say that they don't have it all together or they've changed their mind. But I think we need to give them a little bit, not too much leeway. I'm not saying let them go into heresy and false teaching, but I'm just saying understand that they are men and women who might have conflicting doctrines going on, might be struggling with stuff themselves, and they might think something different in the future. So it helps us to maybe not come down so hard on people that don't have it all together.